We've been talking about Breonna Taylor for a long time. A lot of stories about that particular case. And there was some news story that came out today. We're going to tell you a little bit about that. But her name actually came up in the debate last night, which was interesting. I was not expecting that. I thought this was going to be all very topical level, high level overview type of information. And in fact, we got some pretty good stuff from at least specific questions about Breonna Taylor. So this clip is with Chris Wallace asking Vice President Joe Biden about this, and we're going to dissect that here in a little bit further.
All right. I want to return to the question of race. Vice President Biden, after the grand jury in the Breonna Taylor case decided not to charge any of the police with homicide, you said it raises the question, quote, whether justice could be equally applied in America. Do you believe that there is a separate but unequal system of justice for blacks in this country?
Yes, there is. There's systemic injustice in this country, in education and work and in law enforcement and the way in which it's enforced. But look, the vast majority of police officers are good, decent, honorable men and women. They risk their lives every day to take care of us. But there are some bad apples. And when they occur, when they find them, they have to be sorted out. They have to be held accountable. They have to be held accountable. And what I'm going to do as President of the United States is call together an entire group of people at the White House, well, everything from the civil rights groups to the police officers, to the police chiefs, and we're going to work this out. We're going to work this out so we change the way in which we have more transparency in when these things happen. These cops aren't happy to see what happened to George Floyd. These cops aren't happy to see what happened to Breonna Taylor. Most don't like it. But we have to have a system where people are held accountable. And by the way, violence in response is never appropriate. Never appropriate. Peaceful protest is. Violence is never appropriate.
All right.
Yeah, and I think that was a good answer from Joe Biden. I mean, honestly, that was a good answer. He's calling for more transparency. He's saying most cops are good people, which I agree with. I think that all cops are bad people are wrong on that. We want the good cops. We want more good cops. We want to elevate, promote, and glorify the good cops and punish and expel the bad cops. And it was a good answer, right? Whether you believe he means that or not, based on his 25 years record, passing laws that incriminate more people and justify, bigger prison populations and more arrests and longer time and mandatory minimums and all those things. That's a separate issue. But that answer was a fair answer. And I think that he's on the right track with that, right? I think most of America don't think that cops are just innately bad. And a lot of people are horrified and grossed out by what they see happening to black people around the country. So not a lot to analyze there from Joe Biden's answer, other than I think it was a fair answer, but it is a good segue into more of the Breonna Taylor case, because we learned today that the grand jury was not even presented with murder charges for Breonna Taylor. In other words, we've been talking about this a lot on this channel. Yesterday, we did the analysis. We were talking about whether or not the grand jury heard evidence that would allow them to indict the two officers who were not indicted. Did they hear that evidence, or did Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General, hold that evidence back and decide he wasn't even going to give them the option to charge it? So this story came from WDRB.com. It's a good story. They do an interview with Daniel Cameron, who is the Attorney General. And when he says when the charge of wanton endangerment was announced, Cameron said that he walked them through every homicide offense and also presented information that was available to the grand jury. And so that left the impression for us, and we talked about this yesterday, that the grand jury had discerned all of the possible options. So in other words, Daniel Cameron presented them everything. He said, look, this is the whole universe of potential charges you could charge these cops with. What do you want to do? Do you think they used self-defense? Do you think they murdered her? Do you think they also fired wantonly and recklessly? What do you guys want to do with this case? We thought that maybe was a possibility. But we learned today that's not exactly what happened. So in reality, the Kentucky Attorney General did not present the murder charges to the grand jury about the Breonna Taylor case. And the reason being, he said it was not appropriate to recommend charges for Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, who was the first person through the door, and Detective Myle Cosgrove, whose bullet actually hit and killed Breonna Taylor. He says they fired shots into her apartment he said, and he didn't think it was appropriate to recommend charges to the grand jury. That's from the article. He said, this is what Daniel Cameron said about the grand jurors. He said, they're an independent body. If they wanted to make an assessment about different charges, they could have done that. But our recommendation was that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in their acts and their conduct. So the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, specifically made a charging decision on his own. That's the purpose of the grand jury. Daniel Cameron said, we're not even going to talk to them about those things. We've already reviewed it. We don't think there's enough evidence here. We're just going to give them enough evidence to convict them or to charge the other officer, Detective Brett Hankinson, with an offense, but not the two other guys. So the grand jury didn't even get the opportunity to consider those other possibilities. We fleshed out both of these arguments yesterday. Maybe he gave them very specific information. Maybe he gave them every information. As the Attorney General, as the fact finders, as the police, as the detectives, the law enforcement, they have all the cards. They control the entire investigation. They get to decide what is presented to the grand jury and what isn't. And so if they are selective with the evidence that the grand jury sees, of course they can't charge them. Of course they can't come to a conclusion because they didn't see any of the evidence. And we spent a lot of time on this yesterday talking about there is a grand juror who came out and he wants, or she wants, to come out and actually talk more about this case. They filed a motion in the circuit court yesterday with the request that the judge, one, allow them to speak and tell them what their rights are. Can they talk about these things without being under fear that Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General from Kentucky, is going to sue them or file a contempt of court charges or do something that is going to cause them even more hardship? They're asking for the court for permission to go and talk about these cases because the jurors who were sitting there in the grand jury panel who watched what Daniel Cameron did and then a couple days later saw what he said he did to the public, they don't match. They don't line up, and they want to come out and talk about that. And this is something that we've been saying for a long time, just stinks. It stinks from top to bottom. Detective Hankinson was going into the apartment without an escort. He went over to the hospital to talk to Mattingly. This investigation has been going on for 6-7 months now. It stinks badly. He says, Cameron said, the charge could not prove at trial beyond a reasonable doubt for wanton endangerment against Hankinson. Oh, the charge that we could prove was that Miles Cosgrove, Jonathan Mattingly were fired upon. They were justified in returning their fire, which that was his conclusion. He came to that conclusion. The grand jury didn't come to the conclusion. That's what the grand jury is for. So it's pretty clear to me he didn't give them any evidence about what all happened. And then he actually requested for additional time to release the transcripts.
Was hit.
So we have a clip here. Let's take a look at this clip.
Taylor was hit in the crossfire.
In your grand jury presentation, did you recommend any charges at all against either Mattingly or Cosgrove in the shooting of Breonna Taylor?
Well, basically, your question is about whether we recommended any murder charges against Cosgrove and Mattingly, and the answer is no. Ultimately, our judgment is that the charge that we could prove at trial beyond a reasonable doubt was for wanton endangerment against Mr. Hankinson.
Cameron says presenting the grand jury with a murder charge would not have been appropriate.
They're an independent body. If they wanted to make an assessment about different charges, they could have done that, but our recommendation was that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in their acts and their conduct.
And Cameron says he did tell the jury that the one witness who says he heard the officers announce their presence before knocking down the apartment door later changed his story.
We presented on all of the discrepancies in his testimony. We provided all of that information to the grand jury for them to hear and to process.
Bottom line, in the end, no one faces charges in connection to Taylor's death.
No one, again, doesn't realize the tragedy here, but that also does not give us a license to make charges that are not founded on the law and the facts.
Lawrence, that's what the grand jury is for, my friend. He's coming to conclusions without presenting the evidence to the grand jury. Then he comes around. It's so it's astounding to me that He is saying that a group of grand jurors who are not lawyers, who are probably just people who have zero experience with criminal law in general, he's saying, well, they could have come to an independent conclusion on their own. You're the one who runs the whole proceeding and presents the evidence. Do you think that a grand juror would have the wherewithal to stand up and say, hey, Mr. Cameron, I got a bunch of questions about all of these other issues that have come up here. Can you please go and investigate these things? I'd like to learn more about them. Do you think that any person sitting in that panel would have the confidence and the wherewithal to do that? Or would they trust the judge and the court clerk and the prosecutors who were there and all of the officers who were there who were conducting this show for them? Would they just say, hey, well, I mean, based on what we saw, they told us, they showed us everything. They showed us, they said they gave us all the evidence. Or if somebody raised their hand and said, hey, what about those two other cops? Did any of their bullets, go into the other person's apartment? Why are they not charged with wanton recklessness? What happened to the other 5 bullets? We know that one bullet went from Cosgrove and killed Breonna Taylor, but what happened to the other 5 bullets? Were those Detective Hankinson's bullets? Well, there's a million questions, but did anybody ask those? We're going to find out. We thought we were going to find out today, but no, that is actually getting pushed over to Friday. So what happened, we were expecting it today, but the grand jury recordings will be delayed until noon on Friday. We thought we were going to get them today. So we're going to be listening to those and, combing through those here soon enough. Cameron was the one who actually sought the 1-week delay. So it was originally ordered to be done today. He sought a 1-week delay to push it to next Wednesday, but the judge came back and said, no, you got to release it on Friday. The reason why he wanted that continuance is because he said it was necessary to protect the witnesses, the private citizens named in the recordings. He said his office wants to redact personal identifiers of any named person, and the judge granted the extension until noon on Friday. So we will see if that comes due on Friday.